Welcome to another episode of the Information Addicts Podcast. My name's Cassidy. I'm an information addict, and this is my podcast where I explore information, ideas, and beliefs and try to do those things more responsibly. I'm back. I have been very inconsistent this last month because I have been very consistently sick. I've been ill for over a month and a half and have lost my voice almost every week within that illness, and it is still on a bit of a roller coaster, but I'm finally feeling more on the up and up, like it might finally be the end. So I figured I'd try to start recording again and get things going at least while I'm feeling relatively healthy. But to ease in, I'm going to start with a conversation that I have recorded previously. So today's conversation is with Nathan. Nathan is an acquaintance that I knew from a church that I had gone to previously. And he's really close friends with my friend Christian, actually brother-in-laws with my friend Christian. And every time I've talked with him, and I've spoken with him on this channel, he always suggested that I have a conversation with Nathan because he went through a similar denomination change and trying to figure out what that means to be a part of a denomination and understand that as you're understanding faith and spirituality. So we had that conversation. It's actually the first real conversation we've ever had. So I enjoyed getting to know him, and maybe it'll open up to some other conversations. So I hope you enjoy. Nathan, thanks so much for having a conversation with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Cassidy. Looking forward to it.
Yes, this will be a very interesting one because generally with what I do on my YouTube channel, I talk to close friends or people who I've had lots of conversations with or complete strangers, but you're somewhere in the middle where I know you. We have a lot of acquaintances and friends in common, but I don't think we've actually ever had a conversation one-on-one as I can recall. I don't know if you remember anything.
It was like there was a period of time we were at the same church, but I don't think our paths really crossed very much. So I knew of you, but I do not recall a conversation one-on-one.
Yeah, same. But, I had a friendship with Christian when I was there, and we've had lots of interesting conversations. He's been on this channel before, and I think every conversation I had with him, you should talk to my friend Nathan. He'd be really great to talk with. So I'm like, okay. So I was glad you're up for it. So today we are going to kind of talk about your experience with religion and denominations and all of those things. But before we get too deep into that, why don't you just give a little bit of background? What's your story? Who are you? And how does that sort of intertwine with this process of religion and exploration in that space?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Nathan. I'm 30 years old, live in Phoenix, Arizona, and I'm married and have two young sons. So I have a 2-year-old and a 6-month-old, and that has become the greatest joy of my life, getting to be a husband and father. And then for work, I work in politics. So I work for a think tank in DC, and I do state lobbying for them in a few of the Western states. So in a career that I very much enjoy, and it intersects with theology and morality and how to apply that to the world. So that's stuff that I love to learn about. And a bit about my journey with religion and spirituality. So I grew up in a Christian family. My parents were both very strong Christians, and the sort of church that I went to for the first 16 years of my life was a non-denominational, very much like a Baptist church. So they had that congregational feel to it with church polity. And when you look at their approach to the Bible, it was probably more in line with the dispensational approach, where they believed in a rapture being, if you want to get into end times, the rapture is a separate event, and then later on comes the final second coming of Christ. So that was kind of what they were in. And then in my teen years, they started to go down more of a little bit of a seeker sensitive type church. And there were some issues with finances, dealing with the board and the elders, where they were tying in their personal investments with the church's investments. And so that led to a lot of people leaving the church. And I think that was the last straw with my family. And my dad was a deacon at the time. And that was what led us out of that church. And then my parents, they Went to, I think, two different Baptist churches out after that. The one that they're in now, they've been in for 15 years. So I was in that church a little bit, basically just a conservative Baptist church. Yeah, that was a lot of my background with church. And then comes college. College was different. So college, the church I was in there was also the church that you were a part of.
Yeah.
So in college, the church I was a member of for 10 years was more of a charismatic church. So it focused a lot on college students with their ministry, and it was a non-denominational, charismatic, similar to Pentecostal. What
Yeah.
brought me into that, it wasn't so much the theology at first. When I came to that church, I didn't know what their theology was.
Right.
I just know that my older brother, who was in college, had been met by people in that ministry, and his life had been radically changed in a positive direction. So coming to Arizona State for college, that was the church I planned to get involved with, and I was there for 10 years. And
So you went into college planning like, oh, I want to keep faith alive. It wasn't something like, oh, I go because my parents do. Like it meant something to you.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I became a Christian really early on in life. It
Mm-hmm.
was about 6 years old that I remember having just a conversation with my dad where it clicked. The message I had heard over and over and over again finally made sense of,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I am a sinner. I've offended God. And the only way I can be right with him is for him to come into my heart. Like a 6-year-old version of the gospel was what I understood it, but that is a true gospel, believing that you're a sinner, you need to be saved, and only Christ can save you. So that happened when I was 6. Then those years from about 6 until 16, I had a shallow, superficial Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was in high school in the later years, and I saw my brother and the way that his life had been changed when he was at college, it made me want to be more into my Christian faith and grow more. So 16, 17, about the time I started reading the Bible for myself and making that faith my own, I guess is a good way of putting it. So getting more invested in church. And when I went off to college, I had it set in my mind that I was going to continue that faith and go to a secular school like Arizona State, knowing that there's a lot of people who aren't Christians, but wanting to be a light in that dark place.
Mm-hmm. Great. And so you get connected with this church. How is that process in starting college and having that support system that was aimed at a Christian life? And where were the differences that you really saw between the thing you grew up in that you spent the first 18 years and then what would be the next 10?
Yeah. So the first encounter was with the whole charismatic gifts and gifts of the Spirit,
Yeah.
things like that. So when it came to tongues and prophecy and all those different beliefs, the church I grew up in, it wasn't that they didn't believe in that stuff. It was they never interacted with the text ever. They just kind of glossed over those topics.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was in a church like this, I was in a Bible study my freshman year, and those topics came up. I was intrigued that even though I now I don't necessarily agree with every interpretation that they have with those texts, I was intrigued by the fact that they didn't just skip those texts, and
Right.
instead they explored it from their framework with the Bible. And so that was attractive to me, that they didn't take controversial subjects and skip it.
Right. Well, and it's in that church too, it is has a charismatic leaning, but it's not necessarily something I think you would know right away, right? Like it's something that the more you're involved and the more that you go to more, you know, specific meetings to things, it's like, oh, it shows itself, but it's not the ones where, they're waving flags and it's chaos in a service, that's how I sort of experienced it. I don't know if you had that similar like participation with it. And I mean, you were coming at it 10 years ago, so I don't know how different it was when I came in. Oh gosh, when was it? 4, 5 years ago?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was there from basically 2011 until 2021.
Okay.
Yeah.
So right before or right after COVID then.
And I'd say that the way their charismatic expression was pretty consistent throughout. It was something that they
Yeah.
firmly believed. But when it came to texts, like in First Corinthians, where it gives kind of like the layout of how church flow should be, they didn't like to bring that into church service, the tongues or prophecy without an interpreter. Those were texts that they, or tongues without an interpreter, those were texts that they did follow.
Yeah.
So,
So
yeah.
how was that sort of participation for you, where all of a sudden this thing that wasn't really talked about in your other churches is now being brought up and um, not sort of shied away from, and even kind of encouraged in practice? How did you deal with that? You obviously had this intrigue with it. How was
Mhm.
that for you in like taking the steps into that sort of charismatic world?
At first, I was skeptical, but that skepticism changed when I saw the lives of the people around me. And so I attributed that to this is the secret sauce to the Christian life. So 10 years ago, that was how I interpreted it. I thought
Mhm.
that it was a good thing that they made that kind of a distinctive of their church.
Mm.
And so 10 years ago, I believe that this is something that all Christians should have and need in the way that they taught it. I agreed with. And where I'm at now on the other side of it, I would say I'm in a place where I have a lot more questions than I have answers. And to be honest, I think that it's an issue where scripture says some things but not a lot, and there are such different frameworks for approaching it that I will probably go to my grave with a lot more questions than answers. And I think I'm okay with that, because I don't think that it is the secret sauce to a Christian life. I don't think that it is an area where a church should be built on that being the core function rather than the
Mm.
gospel. So the church I'm in now, for example, there are mixed views on the gifts.
Mhm.
Some people are probably in the cessationist camp, others are more in the continuationist, but they have strict views on how it should be practiced, and that's okay. And in a church, not everyone has to have the same views on things that don't really change the way that church service would be run or how you apply the faith
Mm.
in a corporate setting.
Mm. Yeah. So where did those questions start to come in for you? Did you have sort of this moment where you like it immediately was hit with these questions, or was it sort of a slow drip as you're kind of trying to figure out, okay, um, what is this thing that I'm participating in, and how do we come to understanding about denominations and church practice?
Hmm. Yeah, definitely a slow drip. So in when I was in this church, I didn't always agree with everything, but when it came to their view on baptism of the Holy Spirit in tongues, I was in line with that for a very long time.
Mm.
And then over time, as I started to research theology and my hunger for that grew, I started to have more questions. And a big turning point for me was with um, in COVID. I think that's when I did a lot of time devoted to listening to podcasts and figuring out what I really believed,
Yeah.
being apart from so many people physically. It was great. I was married already, so I wasn't alone during COVID, but I
Yeah.
had a lot of time to be in my head and in the word and in podcasts and doing that kind of work. So there were some different topics that I started to explore into. One of them was water baptism, and that's another topic where I have more questions than answers, because there are such radically different views on water baptism.
Yeah.
And when Christian reached out to me to talk about this podcast, he was like, "Oh, Cassidy wants to talk to someone who's reformed," and so that's another big part of my story from being going through COVID. Because before that, I don't know what I was. I'd call myself anti-Calvinist. I found it offensive, like the idea of Calvinism. But over time, part of it was not knowing exactly what they believed, and then other parts of it were, I think, God just working on my beliefs and what I felt in my heart, and so that kind of changed, and so now I'm in a Reformed camp when it comes to salvation, and I believe that stuff. And through that, I would listen to what Reformed people were saying about tongues and baptism of the Holy Spirit. In the traditional Reformed, Presbyterian, Reformed Baptist, they tend to have a cessationist point of view. But in the evangelical Calvinistic circles, there's very differing views. There are some who are continuationists and still hold on to that Calvinistic way of viewing it. So that's how I started to explore the charismatic stuff from different perspectives.
Yeah. Well, the charismatic stuff's interesting because I mean, I grew up in churches that were similar, right? Where there was a belief in tongues and in certain things in the Holy Spirit. But again, it wasn't very clear because non-denominational churches, nothing's very clear.
No,
Everybody's got a little bit of a different flavor, and there's certain things that are like agreements, but even then it gets tricky. And but yeah, kind of having certain experiences with charismatic churches, there was something intriguing about it, but there's also a skepticism with it, where it was like, I do believe that these things can happen because I read the Bible and, you know, these spiritual things are happening, right? It's clear. I don't think I can deny that. But what form does that look like, and where does that look like? And I went through the spectrum of different sort of charismatic churches, from like, I've been to Bethel conferences to like, you know, something more in line in that church that we were in, where I would say, yeah, it's got a charismatic flavor, but it's almost like sneakily charismatic, if you will. Not like they're trying to hide anything, but it's sort of like you almost, if you'd gone for a while, it takes a while to kind of get to that place where that's open. And I think for them, there's a fairness to it, where it kind of plays with that idea of like, yeah, maybe there's not, how would you say, like interpreters needed for the service, but when we do these things, it is more closed for members, you know, in a more controlled environment to avoid chaos, I guess. So there's very interesting with that. And I mean, yeah, there's there's still a lot of questions with all of that and that process with that, but yeah, it felt like the way that we processed and learned how to participate with those, it felt like experiments. Like, how do we know the right way to engage in these things and like these processing these things? And there were times where people would be like, oh, just speak in tongues. And it's like, what do you mean just speak in tongues? I can't just speak in tongues. Sorry. I don't know. Did you ever have that sort of struggle with the participation in your own self in doing that? Because that was something that I struggled with too, where it's like, I'm not saying this is BS, but I also don't know the proper orientation for myself. And I don't want to throw myself into something that, that is hyped by emotion or like a group think sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I remember my first time, it was like they had laid hands on me, prayed for me to be baptized in the Holy Spirit, and then a couple days later go back to my dorm room, and then as I'm praying and I'm really praying to God, like, God, I really want this. I really want this. And then I just felt the urge to speak out in tongues. And looking back on it, in the moment, it was, oh great, God is coming in and he's giving me the gift of tongues. Looking back on it, it's like, you know, that if you have an expectation that a pattern is a certain way, you can almost trick yourself into doing it because there's an expectation that something will happen. So was that a spiritual gift, or was that just babbling because it was a pattern I had seen and I had attributed that to the way something looks or I perceive it in the text? So now when I look back on it, I'm really not sure. I think it probably was that. But yeah, lots of questions about, is tongues, is it a real language, or is it more of the, I don't want to be offensive, but gibberish, it sounds like, right? Are those both different kinds of tongues? The way that I was taught tongues was that, oh, there's two different kinds of tongues. There is a gift of tongues that only some people have, and that's an actual language. But there is the prayer language of tongues that isn't an actual language.
Mm-hmm.
Is that really in the text? Like, when I've gone back to the
Mm.
text, I don't necessarily see that dichotomy between those two different kinds. And so I think that whether it exists for believers today or not, the way that a church functions is probably going to be similar with how they, if they're taking into consideration First Corinthians and what it says there. But yeah, just the also, I'd say that my belief over time grew that if this is a good gift from God that he wants me to have, when I see it in the Bible, it's not people who are in faith just deciding to make a noise and then a tongue comes out.
Yeah.
No, like Pentecost, God is literally making them speak in tongues. They're not exercising faith. God is doing that work in them. So if God really wants me to do that, I'm going to trust that that is something he will do in my life, but I'm not going to move in faith for something that I don't see as clear in the word of God.
Yeah. Well, and how has moving into more of a reformed church, has it helped with those questions? Is it settling something in you? Or is it still opening up even more questions? Because in some ways that's probably rewriting your whole ideas of what what you were given.
Yeah, it hasn't answered a lot of questions, I'll be honest, on this one. The church I'm in now, one of the things about it that they really care about is on Sundays doing expository teaching where they're in a book of the Bible, so anything in the text, they're going to address it. So similar to how in the previous church, they would address certain difficult texts. I appreciate in this one that they also address difficult texts, even if it's going to be different conclusions. But on something like tongues, just because there's radically different views in people who I'd say are in my own camp, it's going to be hard for me to land on something. So I have to be in a place where I'm comfortable saying, I'm not entirely sure if this does exist. I'm going to believe that God is going to do it, and it's not going to be someone just doing it in their own power. So, for example, with gifts of healing. So some people will say that cessationists don't believe in miracles and gifts of healing. And that's a mischaracterization of their position. Their position is that no individuals have a gift of healing. God still heals, and he can do that act through a person, but it's not like in the times of the apostles where there is an individual with that gift, and nearly every time that they pray for someone to be healed, that miracle happens. No, like a faithful Christian should pray for the sick. And if God wants to do a miraculous work, God will choose to do a miraculous work. So I think that that's kind of my philosophy behind those other gifts too. I'm not going to go out and actively seek to speak in tongues, but if God were to make me speak in another language and someone else were to understand it and hear the gospel, that would be a miracle. And that's the lens I would view it through, God doing a miracle because he's still working in this world and doing miracles.
But yeah, it's interesting. My dad, he became a Christian in college at some point. And he was in a Bible study or something. And he was with a friend who actually was very skeptical of like whole speaking in tongues thing. And just didn't believe it could happen. And he's in this Bible study and he's talking, and all of a sudden everybody's just looking at him like he's crazy. And someone in the circle goes, "Can anybody translate that?" And then there was someone else in the circle who said, "Yes, I understood what he said," and then was like able to translate that. And he didn't even recognize that he was speaking in tongues. And it's one of those stories where it was like, well, that feels very different than some of the recipes, if you will, of like how to do those things. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. I just don't know a better word of like how to process that. Maybe like the liturgy or the pattern in which we do that properly. So that was always sort of a question for me. I mean, I still have certain questions with all of those things, but being Orthodox makes it a little bit easier because there's a lot of reliance on mystery. And there's a lot less of a hope or pressure for young Christians or young people to the faith traditions to be presenting any of these sort of spiritual gifts. It's very much a practice. Not that it can't happen, but It's just sort of a different, it's a slower, more patient mindset. So that's been interesting. I don't know how it feels with you in Reformed. Does it feel like that pressure's off, or does it feel yeah, sort of like in that middle stage where you're still sort of floating in it a little bit, trying to like parse through the different ideas?
Pressure's definitely off, since that's such a it's something in the Bible, but it's not a primary issue. The pressure's off. I don't feel the need to try and do that. After I transitioned from that church to the more reformed church, there were some times where I kind of felt like, oh, should I still be doing this tongues thing since I cared
Mm.
about it so much? And then
Mm.
over time, I think there's just so much more in the Bible that are commands that I didn't feel a guilt or concern that that wasn't part of my walk anymore. And then
Mm.
wrestling through the text about whether or not that private prayer language is something there, the way it's described, and if we're supposed to do it as Christians, I think there was a burden off my shoulders that it is perfectly okay for me to not be doing that, and that it's not me having a lack of faith.
Sure. Well, and outside of just sort of belief and what you can recognize with, where was the moment that you sort of came to the realization of, oh, I think I might have to move to a different church or try a different tradition? Because 10 years, that's a long time to be in a church. And, to be in a church that's a college ministry. Because usually it's like you go to college, you finish and you leave. But, and obviously there's actually a lot of people in that sort of position there. And I think it has a lot to do with the people and that
Absolutely.
community that they foster there. But I mean, where was that? And was there a struggle there with you and maybe even your wife as you're both leaving this thing?
Yeah. So, like you said, it's the people. That was what kept me in the church for so long, because I had some real disagreements the last half of my tenure at the church. I'd say the last 5 years, there were some real disagreements. But what I always came back to is these are people I care about. They have the core of the gospel right. In any church that I go to, there's going to be differences.
Right.
So that kept me around for a long time. And um, yeah, I had very good positive experiences there, but over time, yeah, my theology was changing as I was reading the scriptures more. And um yeah, about COVID was when I really dove into the reform stuff, and I was grappling so much with the sovereignty of God over salvation. So that was a key thing I was wrestling with for probably a year and a half or 2 years. And when I was dealing with that, I knew that everything I had grown up with was anti-Calvinist. Like, it just seemed offensive that there are people in this world who will not choose God and don't have the ability to choose God. That's how I would put it previously when I was anti-Calvinist. But then some of the people I listened to would talk about how oftentimes we'll bring our preconceived notions about free will, that Western mindset, into the text and think of it almost like we have this libertarian free will where we can choose anything we want. And that's just not the reality of the world we live in. I think most people would agree. You are very limited by who you are, what you're born into, who your family is, your height, your strength, all of that stuff factors in. So there's not like this real libertarian free will that Americans like to believe is possible. And then reading texts like, there's the proof text that the Reformed people use, but I really couldn't shake it over the period of a year and a half of reading and listening to podcasts and praying. And then I just got to the point where I said, okay, I do actually have a reformed view of salvation. I believe that God is sovereign over all of life, including salvation, and that we are all here on earth completely unable to come to God on our own. And it's only if He acts first that people can come to them and have that regenerate heart. And those that He does save, they will be preserved till the end, they will persevere. So having that belief, and I was in hope for quite a while having that belief. So
Mm.
even being reformed in my view of salvation, I stayed in hope for probably another year because I believe that there was a very high threshold for what it should take for me to move out of this
Yeah.
church and into another.
Right.
But there were some other smaller ones. I would just say it was a bunch of small issues adding up over time, where what eventually drove me to look for other churches, it came down more to their view on ecclesiology. So, theology of the church. What is the church's mission?
Mm.
How should the church focus? Those ended up being the things where I had such great disagreements that I eventually got to the place where I could not, in good conscience, be a part of that church just
Mm.
because my views didn't align with theirs on that stuff.
Right.
Still respect so many people there. They are absolutely Christians, they are in the family, but there were just stark disagreements on that.
Sure.
And I needed to find a church where I could, in good conscience, submit to the elders and that they would have a similar view to mine. And with my wife, so she came into Hope when we were dating. She was a part of another church,
Mm.
non-denominational, good Bible church. And then we started dating, and she started coming to the church I was at in college. And her initial reaction was, wow, I was not expecting this from the guy I was dating. I know he's a solid Christian, and this just doesn't look like my other church experiences. But she formed such great friendships in the church that
Yeah.
even though she had differing views on things like tongues, she was totally fine submitting. But when I got to the place of wanting to lead our family out of that church and into another, she was okay with it. It was hard at first because of the relationships that weren't there anymore, but
Right.
she quick dove in, and she's doing great in our new church.
That's good. I mean, there's sometimes that, and you never quite know where people are, right? 'Cause I think for myself, I had a similar position to you probably in your last half tenure, where it was like I liked a lot of the things, and I believed a lot of, at the time, believed a lot of the things that um, the cores of the church stood for, but there was these little problems of trying to wrestle with these questions of what it is to be a Christian, and the the best participation in those things, that slowly kind of led to me leaving. And I mean, finding orthodoxy was a big part of that too, where at a certain point I realized, like, oh, I gotta look at this thing seriously, because
Mhm.
yeah, it's making more sense to the thing that I was given before. And that's where it's really hard, because I talk to a lot of people who are trying to figure out, how do we, either they've left faith or they're struggling with faith, and this idea of like loyalty to a tradition or a church, and that feeling, which I felt very much too, where it's like, church is not something I want to treat like a consumer product. I don't
Mhm.
want a church be perfectly suited to me and everything that I like, and I'm checking my boxes. Like, you're part of a body, there's always going to be things that are hard to deal with, or might not be personal to my taste. But where is that place where you're aligning yourself with the things you do believe and getting that support to do those things? And so I think it is very hard. I know it's very hard to have that shift and feel like you have to leave. And I don't know, I think sometimes it can feel like you're abandoning, or people feel like you're abandoning, when it's far more complicated, I feel.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Part of the conversation too, especially with people who grew up in the church and are just not enthusiastic about how things are going, really is that tradition, wanting to get closer to some sort of historic Christian tradition.
yeah.
And I know for me, it was having slightly more tradition, being in a reformed but still evangelical church. And that was enough for me. But it sounds like your path was much different with going to Orthodox Christianity.
Well, yeah, I mean, I didn't plan it. I'll be honest, I didn't plan it. I knew before I went to my first Orthodox service, I had come to the conclusion that where I was, the church that we were at, um, just it was it was too much tension for me to be healthy in it and continue to participate. So I knew I probably had to be open to something else, and I wasn't going to run away from it, but I'm just going to be open to something different. And I thought it would just be some other Protestant church. But around that time, I started meeting all of these Orthodox people and realizing, oh, I don't know anything about Orthodoxy. I mean, I know a little bit about Catholicism, and you get much more sort of that. I grew up in a somewhat Catholic antagonistic household. Not that they hated Catholics, but there was the question of like, well, are they really Christians and all of these things? And so I didn't have an antagonism to it, and I did do a little bit of research to it, but I knew I wasn't Catholic from what I had done, but I really didn't know anything about Orthodoxy. And so having these conversations, and eventually someone says, oh, go to a church, just go to a service. And I was like, okay. And I've never liked ritual, even when Protestant churches try to bring it in and do these like ritual prayers and things. It always was like, I don't know what this is. I don't get it. I don't it's weird to me. But like going in, I don't know what it was. If it was, well, I think it had a lot to do with just the time and the life that I lived, and the breaking of the categories of the things I knew about the Bible and the stories, and yeah, all of these things that when I was younger I felt so clear, and then realizing, oh wait, this is a text that's thousands and thousands of years old with so much cultural baggage on it that I know nothing. And so I go into this service and I see the rituals, and all of a sudden it like strikes up these things that I had been reading and like shifting my mind on in the Bible, and realizing, oh, everything they're doing has meaning, and I don't know what it means, but I'm intrigued to know. And then, talking to the priest, and they answer some of my questions. And I didn't have a ton. I didn't even fully know what to ask, but, I asked, I think, some questions on icons and praying to saints and baptisms. And the answer they gave me just sat in my like spirit in a way that nothing else had. I was like, oh, that makes sense. Okay. And, it was just like, I don't know what to do here. So I left that service going, I don't know what this is, but I can't keep calling myself a Protestant, and I have to look at this more. Yeah, 2 years later, I converted. So it eventually led me there. But yeah, I was surprised by how much of the tradition and the story that lied in Orthodoxy started making a lot more sense to the thing that I was given, and giving me some peace to the answers that I had been turning stones in for years. Because, yeah, I don't know how much but probably when I was 24, 25, I went through like a deconstruction phase where I started questioning everything about my faith, and be like, well, is God even real? I don't know. I've accepted it and I feel like it's real, but like, just because I feel like something's real doesn't mean it is. And so you go through this intense like search of trying to understand, okay, how do we come to these questions, and going through philosophy of like theism and non-theism, and how do you come to good arguments about those things, and what do all these other religions believe? I've been told Mormons are crazy, but what do they actually believe, and how do they come to those things? And just talking to so many people, and just being really open to be convinced to whatever it was. And that led me back to Christianity, and I like went back to this default Protestantism, but that was really hard, going back into the church, asking all these questions and kind of breaking these categories, and having a confidence in like Jesus and Christ and Christianity, but not knowing what that fully meant. Because I was like, well, there's all these denominations. There's probably one that's more true than the other, but whether I'll ever get to one that I commit to in my life, I don't know. And I just really wasn't even at that part in my life where I could fully like engage with those questions well, of like what denomination is true. I just had to kind of get back into like church life and deal with the tension of what it was to see what it looked like on the outside for people who despise Christianity or found it not compelling, and wrestling with some of the true things they saw within the participation of it. And and so there's a long journey of doing that and going through that tension, and then just finding Orthodoxy at that moment where it like clicked in my brain or something. But yeah, it's been very helpful for me. I do think it's a much I trust the process of how they came to what they do more. And I mean, there are certain things like as I was sort of in this middle stage, there's a couple processes when you become Orthodox. First, you come to the church and you just go. And then after you go for a while, you can become a catechumen, which is basically stating your interests to become Orthodox. And then from there, you have a period where you work with the priest to kind of understand and learn about the church and make sure you understand what you're committing to. And then you'll eventually have a chrismation. And so during my time where I was just sort of going, I was doing a lot of studying, poking, prodding, trying to understand what this thing is. And I actually went back to the church that we went to and I listened to a sermon. And I was a guest speaker, but they said a couple things that made me realize, oh, I'm not Protestant anymore. Because at first it was like, I can't call myself a Protestant because I don't fully know what that means. But then it was like, oh, I'm not. Because they talked about sola scriptura and faith alone. And they were two things as I was reading through the Bible again and wrestling through those things. And listening to the Orthodox perspective and some of these more traditional perspectives, I went, oh, that story makes a lot more sense. And yeah, it felt more like those sayings felt like a Protestant dogma that were sort of fighting against Catholicism. And Orthodoxy and Catholicism are similar in some ways, but they have some distinctions. I feel like Orthodoxy in thought is much more similar to Protestantism, but it has, well, and that's hard to say too, but that's how it felt. Like there was a lot of things that I believed as a Protestant that came over to Orthodoxy, but there were some adjustments that like fit the story and the full sense of it better. And like the structure of it. And, I didn't think I would like structure, but I think after being in such unstructured churches for so long, to have that sort of like order and like understanding of how things work, there's a little bit of like, it certainly has its inconveniences, but there's like a bit of a security and understanding in that. But yeah, those were two things where I kind of got stuck. And then when I figured out, oh, okay, I'm not Protestant, and I was like, well, where am I going to go? I don't have anywhere to go. So that's when I became a catechumen. I kept moving into Orthodoxy, and then I looked into Judaism right before I became officially Orthodox, because it was sort of the last unexplored territory, which is not fully true because so much of Judaism is built into Christianity, and the Old Testament texts are Jewish texts. And even the New Testament texts, most of them were written by Jews. There was that interesting process of going to Shabbat services and seeing the similarity in those services to the similarity of the Orthodox liturgy. And there was something in me that went, well, if Jesus came to fulfill the law, not abolish it, shouldn't there be some similarity to these two faiths? And if I had gone straight from a Protestant church that I had come from to a Jewish service, absolutely no connection or contention, comparison. But with Orthodoxy, it was almost like, oh, this is very similar. But yeah, there was that problem with Jesus, where it's like, well, I don't think I'd be a very good Jew because I have a particular view of Jesus that I don't think is quite. I talked to a rabbi, and he was like, so what's your perspective on Jesus? I'm like, well, we don't really think about him. I'm like, yeah, well, I have that problem where it's like, there's something so compelling about the character of Jesus and what we know about him. But anyways, I don't know if that totally makes sense, but yeah, it wasn't planned, and I did not think I would like it, but somehow I'm here, and it has been very helpful, but it hasn't been the easiest because my family doesn't fully understand it. But
yeah, there isn't much understanding of the Eastern Orthodox faith in America. I know I can probably count on my hand the number of Orthodox Christians I know.
Yeah. Well, but they exist and it's there, but I don't know. There's this battle with like the Catholic Protestant, and they dialogue with each other all the time. So it's like, much more about Catholicism, even though I probably don't quite know quite enough about Catholicism to feel comfortable about talking about it with any confidence. But there was much more of an understanding of that in the denominational landscape between Orthodoxy. It's almost sort of like the cousin you never talk about. But it's very interesting and different. um, yeah, I don't know how quite to explain it too, because there is a certain difference in perspective that comes with orthodoxy that makes it hard to kind of fully connect with all of the stories that come with the Western traditions, because a lot of Western traditions, it's very much about sin and like judgment for sin. But in Orthodoxy, the frame is much more life and death, where participation in sin leads to death, not only spiritually, but quite literally. And we avoid death to, and sometimes die to our own wants to participate in sin or death to bring life. And, the story of Jesus coming in, taking on death and overcoming it is a very symbolic pattern of this like death and life. And I'm not very good at talking about it, but hearing that story, it was just like, oh, that's very interesting. And it made sense of a lot of the other narratives and things in life that I'd been struggling with. And I mean, there's still a million questions. I don't want to say I've got it all figured out, because I absolutely don't. But there was something nice about going from a space of like incredible fear and uncertainty and constantly just turning stones to something that all of a sudden was like, okay, it makes enough sense that even the questions I have a trust that I can find it and work within that uncertainty within this frame. Yeah. Which I think everybody.
I had probably 2 weeks where I'm like, oh, I really want to learn about Orthodox faith, because that was when like Francis Chan was doing his interviews with Eastern Orthodox, Hank, whatever, the
Hank
old Bible.
Hanegraaff, yeah.
I remember watching the videos and I'm just like, why can't they just give answers? Like, this question is asked, why can't you just give a one-line answer? So that was just realizing how much different that framework is for approaching the faith. It's like, all right, this is much different framework. And yeah, you're right about the Western mindset. It's very much about looking at things in legal terms.
Yeah.
That is very much the way I view everything. Like, I work in politics, I look at everything in those legal type of terms.
Oh yeah, I'm sure that doesn't help too, because you're like seeped in that mindset of like legalities and public policy and all of these things, and all of a sudden, yeah, you talk to a Orthodox and how can I learn about the church? Go to liturgy. Okay, but what book can I read? Read the lives of the saints. What? Like, it's just not Western. And so they're very participation first. And that's sort of hard for me in a sense. I mean, I'm like, in some ways, like my early faith, it was very participation first, because I didn't need the theology and all of the answers in my head figured out. I was just like, okay, I say I believe this thing. I've been raised to believe this thing. Why don't I live like I believe it and see if that changes? And like live as best as I can through what I understand this life to ask of me. And it changed my life. It did. And so I kept going. And then it wasn't until, 5 years in where you hit the wall of the questions where the atheists, I'm not an atheist, but they have good questions to ask. And, the things that sometimes they see as problems in the church, I go, oh yeah, I see those as problems too. Maybe there's something deeper, and, pull the string long enough. And funny enough, my religious conversion was somewhat tied to politics because I was abroad during the 2016 election. And all of a sudden Trump wins the election. I'm sitting there and I'm already going through like religious questions as I'm reading, New Atheists and all of these things. But I sit there and I go, okay, hold on one second. We were told time and time again, Trump could never win. There's no way he's ever going to win. Yet he's president, and we believed it without even questioning it, or so many people did. And for me, that same question is like, well, what else am I doing that with? And there was that whole processing of understanding not only just the religious questions, but the political questions and how we participate and how we know those things. And being sort of a filmmaker too, there was a media question going on too, of like, how do we represent these things and the way that we're understanding them and taking these stories in through media and trying to understand those. And that's that's where it was interesting, where I went through 5 years of a lot of like questioning and apologetics and philosophy and some theology, but I didn't get too far caught in the details of all the differences of the Protestant theology, although when I was younger I did, because I went to Christian schools, so you had to. But yeah, then Orthodoxy came and it was all of a sudden, okay, participate in this thing. And like as you participate, you slowly get pieces of the story. And that was hard for me at first, but then there was also kind of a piece in it. And I don't know, I just had this trust. I can't quite explain it, but there was just a trust in like myself, in like the feeling of it that felt more secure than the exploration of any other church or tradition that I've ever been in. And I don't know what that is. And I don't know if it was me deluding myself into something, but it certainly, after 2 years of doing the poking and prodding and asking the questions, still led me there. So I don't know. I just take it as a grace, but I understand that difficulty though, of like, you can't get a straight answer from an Orthodox. Well, we're coming close to time. Do you have any other questions, or is there anything else you kind of want to like talk and address that you think is important about this topic?
One last thing that I want to talk a little bit about. So I was touching on like the church ecclesiology stuff that was leading me out.
Yeah.
So I think that was the biggest thing that unraveled in me. That was like the biggest thing I had to confront and realize that the megachurch way of Christianity in America was what I had such a problem with. And having the most important part of liturgy being, oh, it's just about the live band and the fog machine, because we're going to tube in the sermon from somewhere else. And the person giving the sermon is not an elder you're submitting to who knows your name and you see the face. Like there's a video on the screen. That kind of Christianity was what frustrated me. And then like the tagline that you hear at some of these more secret churches about, once you become a Christian, this church isn't about you anymore. It's like, wait, what? When has the church ever believed that once you're a Christian, the church isn't about you? The church is the people who are called out of the world. So therefore, service should be about those who are in the church. So that was a shift that had to happen in my mind, confronting that and coming to terms with that way of doing American secret megachurch is not very compatible with what I saw in scripture. So yeah, basically where I landed now, it's still a non-denominational church, but it's reformed. There are 10 different congregations in the state that each have their own elders and live preaching at all of them. Every congregation exposits the same text every week, but what unifies them is theology. So all the pastors get together every week and they go through the text that they're going to go through. So it's kind of formed like its own denomination. So that's what's interesting. It's like a Presbyterian type of model, even though it's not a PCA church, for example.
So you guys all read the same, like the 10 church in these little congregation, you all read the same scriptures and are talking about the same things. Like there's a unity there. That's interesting. Yeah. So it does seem like, sort of a step back to tradition, where it's borrowing some of these things from the more traditional churches, but still on that cusp of, trying to figure that out.
It's definitely still evangelical.
Yeah.
And I know that if I, like you mentioned earlier, it's not good to be a consumer and to pick your church based off of, I want all of my preferences met. My preferences are certainly a little more traditional than like the music would be. I prefer hymns and psalms and that over most of the contemporary songs. This church does a mix. If I were to pick a church that was my ideal, it would have fewer of the contemporary, but I'm not going to pick a church off of that.
Sure.
Yeah, I'd say they do more of the tradition, which I'm comfortable with. It's not fully traditional. It's not an Anglican church, but things like communion, we do communion every week, and I appreciate that. I think that that's something that was lost. The reformers probably took it too far, the ones that went and got rid of a lot of the communion because of the differences with the Catholic Church's view. And so now the non-denominational churches that do it once a quarter, I think that that's too far. They
Yeah.
should, it's good to incorporate communion back in. Public reading of scripture where, we all stand together and read scripture. I think that's a good practice. Every week there's a benediction. It's like, okay, lift your hands and pray this benediction. Those are all things that are more of a tradition, but I think that that is good. I used to be anti-tradition, and seeing how some of these seeker churches create their own traditions that aren't tied to anything in the Bible. Churches are going to have traditions. They're either going to be tied to the historic church's tradition, or they're going to make them up, and it'll probably be in line with culture. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's kind of something I
Oh,
conclude.
yeah, that's a whole other interesting topic. And I have so many thoughts about tradition, especially now being in like one of the most traditional branches of Christianity to be, but we probably don't have time for that. But maybe some other time, bring you and Christian back, and we can
That'd be
all
fun.
talk about
Yeah.
that. That would be
I'd
fun.
love that. A human Christian. That'd be a great conversation.
All right. Well, thank you, Nathan. This was really fun, and I'm glad we finally got to chat. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I will close the Serenity Prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.